Welcome to a presentation of the James City County Williamsburg Master Gardener Association. Today's topic, berms and buffers, with Dr. Lori Fox.
Good morning, everyone. I wanted to introduce Dr. Lori J. Fox. She's a horticulture associate of the Virginia Tech in the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences. She works at the Hampton Roads Agricultural, Research and Extension Center. And she's going to be doing a presentation today on berms and buffers. Dr. Fox has been with Virginia Tech for 28 years. So she has a lot of experience and knowledge, and she's going to share some of that with us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fox and thanking her for making the trip up here.
I usually talk about buffers and other stormwater type practices. So this was actually fun to put this presentation together and include berms in it for you guys today. So pretty much a berm is just basically a raised piece of land. It's either a bank, a ridge, or a mound. It can be totally naturally occurring, or it can be something that is man-made, something artificial. Usually you run into berms in places like rain gardens where you may be on a slope and you need a berm on the downslope side. Because with a rain garden, of course, you're trying to pond and catch water, and you have to have the berm on the backside to give you the level surface. You also run into berms a lot of times with swales, which again is stormwater management. Sometimes you have berms on slopes to help with erosion. And oftentimes you have berms adjacent to shorelines, again, to either stabilize the slope or the shoreline itself. In this picture here, there's actually two types of berms here. The one on the left, actually the berm is being used as a walkway, as a pathway through this particular property. Which is actually really cool, although I would not want the maintenance contract for that. I think you could mow the top, but then the sides would be, pretty labor intensive. And then of course, a more natural looking type of berm situation on the right. And you guys experience this more up here than we do because you have topography. Back in Norfolk and Virginia Beach, we're rather flat. So in that case with berms, when you do incorporate them into a landscape, you kind of need to make sure they look sort of natural, like they belong, as opposed to something that's been, plopped down from outer space. All right, so berms have a lot of purposes and benefits. It really is depending on what you're trying to do in the landscape. A lot of times they are part of your design and they are used to enhance the aesthetics of your design, the look of the design. The other thing is that I deal with a lot is you can use them very strategically to assist with stormwater runoff or with drainage issues as far as directing the runoff. You can also use berms. I've seen them used frequently as barriers. So I've seen them if you have like a corner property, people will put a berm on the corner to prevent headlights from coming in the windows of their home, or in some cases, if it's a busy intersection, they'll hit the berm if they go off the road before they hit the house or anything else. You laugh, but it happens. So you can also use them for in protection in that way, property protection. And then again, on the downslopes of stormwater management, like for rain gardens, so that you're creating a trap, so to speak. They can be used again to slow and direct water movement. Probably, if you're not already aware, one of the most frequently asked questions that come into extension offices, master gardener help desks, things like that, is how to deal with managed runoff in your landscape, because it comes onto the property somewhere. It has a definite pathway through the property, and then it exits the property at some point. So how and where and what it's doing may require you to strategically sort of direct it where you want it to go. Berms can also act as filters. You'll see berms a lot of times on construction sites, where runoff will, hit the berm and, actually go through it, but, it will drop the sediment out and act as a biofilter for the pollutants, if any, coming off of the site. But oftentimes they are meant to keep sediment on site. And again, stabilize slopes, and believe me, we'll have pictures of these things. And then again, relative to water management, we have water coming off of the landscape side of things, but we also have a lot of water coming from water side of things, the ocean, the bays, rivers, and so we're kind of caught in the middle here in Hampton Roads. And so while they don't prevent flooding, they can help moderate the impacts of flooding. So let's take a look at some examples, because I find that pictures are worth 1,000 words. That's very true. So anyway, this is just an example of slope stabilization, and they have used the berms adjacent to a pathway. And they have, of course, planted them with lots of beautiful color so that they are actually, not only functional, but they are very attractive as well. And in this case, you've got, from a design aesthetic standpoint, you're looking at it from that walkway or pathway side. So you have a really interesting opportunity to display a variety of plants at different heights and create a lot of interest with that particular design. Again, here, this is, sort of privacy and protection for this property, which obviously is on a corner. And, you may not want everybody riding or driving by or walking by to see what you're doing in your landscape. And again, if somebody leaves the road, you may not want them, you want something between the vehicle and your home. So it's the berm and the plants in this case. And in this example, this is evergreen plants, mainly shrubs and trees, where before the picture was predominantly perennials. So you can have very differing effects. You can have the same berm, but with different plant material, you can have different effects. And this is just another one. This is a situation again in a park. And they wanted to, again, display bulbs in this case, beautiful tulip bulbs. And they're very flat. And sometimes it's nicer to look at a certain plant when it's raised up a little bit versus you being taller and looking down on it. So when you use a berm to create some topography, it gives you a whole different look or a viewpoint of the plants that you might be displaying. Berms are often used in landscapes as sort of a backdrop to a water feature, especially if you want any type of waterfall or anything like that. And again, in this case, you need to work it in from a design standpoint in a way that it looks like it fits in the landscape. So for this particular water feature here, they sort of back the berm up to the fence with some trees behind it, instead of having it out in the center of a very flat area, and it just doesn't, look like it belongs. And so what they've done is create the berm. They've used stonework and brought that stonework sort of down and into the landscape around the pond area, but also sort of lining the pathways so that it's connected from the design standpoint. Great. So rain gardens, again, on the downslope side, if to the right of the picture here, you can see they've created this berm here, because the whole point of having a rain garden, which is the most popular stormwater management, tool in a landscape, is you've got to create this sort of flat ponding area that temporarily holds the runoff. And so in that regard, berms are very important. Now we will talk a little bit more a little later about plants, but this is a really good graphic to illustrate both with berms and buffers. You have 3 distinct planting zones. So you have a low planting zone, which is at the sort of the base of the berm or the base of the buffer, which stays the wettest longest. You have in the middle of the slope, and then you have the top of the berm or the buffer. And so a lot of it, what you put in there, from a design standpoint, as how tall the berm is, but also how frequently the different areas are going to be inundated with water. And so the top of the berm, the buffer tends to be more your, if there is such a thing, traditional or typical landscape plants. The middle gets periodic inundation, and then the lowest, gets more frequent inundation or is right there at the water's edge in the case of the buffers. So we'll have another graphic to show a little bit more on that in a few minutes. All right, does anybody have any questions on buffers? It's kind of a short part of the presentation. They're not terribly complicated, unless you're asking them to do something specific like filter. And then there's a specific way you might create the berm with specific mix of materials. But they're not terribly complicated. All right, so buffers. A buffer is an area of vegetation that borders a body of water. And it's just that simple. And you find buffers very frequently adjacent to living shorelines and wetland areas, adjacent to streams and rivers. You can find them around like drinking water reservoirs, and they should be around stormwater ponds, but oftentimes they're not. People tend to mow the grass right to the water's edge. Around stormwater ponds. And then, of course, my office gets the phone call, we've just lost, 4 feet of shoreline. What should we do? And we don't have a budget, and we don't have a design, and we just don't know what to do. And nobody is in agreement on anything. And I said, well, the first thing you should do is just tell your landscape contractor to stop mowing to the water's edge. The buffer will come when you stop mowing. But anyway, you can find buffers on their own, but more often they're in conjunction with other types of landscape features and stormwater practices. So when I talk to people, I can't assume ever that they know what I'm talking about. You're probably in the same situation as master gardeners. It's it's in the fine print of y'all's contract to be educators, which means talking to people about things that they may not be familiar with. And so, I'm sure most everybody's experienced it at one time or another. You start talking about something that you're passionate about, or that's a new concept, and, the eyes start glazing over. The key there is you have to find a way to connect with people, some way that whatever you're going to talk about impacts or has meaning to them. But you can't assume that they know even the most basic information. So, and I've learned this from experience, so I put graphics in here that can be rather simple, but what this does is now it puts the buffer in its place in the bigger picture of things, where it occurs. So if you're going from left to right, you have the landscape, and you've got water that kind of flows, or the landscape progresses into a buffer, into a shoreline, into a wetland. So you know kind of what direction you're going in, and now you know where in the scheme of things the buffer falls. And again, buffers have a lot of purposes, but they're really, really critical for stormwater management because they intercept that runoff coming from the upland landscape. And their purpose is to slow it down, spread it out, soak it in. Okay, like other stormwater practices that are vegetated, buffers have the same 3 goals, and those are key. Slow it down, spread it out, soak it in. When you slow runoff down, it has a chance to infiltrate or evaporate or be absorbed by the plants. And when you spread it out, again, over a wider land area, those things happen more, as opposed to, running it through a pipe or, gutter downspout or something like that, where you're concentrating it and it's moving really fast. So, and then, slowing it down, spreading it out, gives sediment a chance to drop out and gives your plants a chance to act with their biofiltration practices to remove any kind of pollutants, especially nutrients. But plants are really great at breaking down a wide variety of other types of pollutants too. And then hopefully, by the time the runoff gets through that buffer and to the shoreline and into the receiving body of water, there's a lot less volume of water, and it's not moving very fast. And what does get through the buffer is much cleaner, so that you're not dumping pollutants right into the body of water, because it is much more difficult to treat and deal with pollutants once they're in the water versus trying to deal with them up upland in the landscape. All right, so purposes for buffers, again, slow the water down, spread it out, and infiltrate it. Buffers filter sediment. They cause, by the slowing down of the water, they cause the sediment, which is heavier particles, your soil and organic matter particles, cause those particles to drop out, which means you're not filling in your shoreline and getting shallow water, which is your first requisite for growing algae, right? It also acts as a great nutrient sink. So the plants, of course, need nutrients and they will filter those out. And again, those nutrients are not getting into the body of water, promoting algae growth. Buffers are an opportunity to, again, from a design perspective, add some visual interest, maybe add some diverse species that you aren't able to use in other parts of your landscape. And then probably right after dealing with runoff, the key purpose is stabilization of that shoreline. Because again, we've got the runoff coming from upland, but we've got the water coming from the water side of things. And I'm sure we've all seen banks that have gotten undercut or eroded away, especially on a day like today where the water's choppy, got a lot of wave action going on. So it doesn't have to be a big storm or anything. But, you know, when somebody says I've lost 4 feet of my shoreline, you know, they've lost property. And it's not easy, if you can even get it back, relative to where it is and what kind of permits and regulations govern that shoreline. So, you know, you lose property if you don't stabilize those shorelines, and buffers are probably the least expensive and least amount of effort to incorporate for the biggest return on shoreline stabilization. Buffers also provide a really great opportunity for food and habitat for wildlife. So again, wildlife, they need the water and need access to the water. And so, you know, you have to give them the cover and the ability to live and access the water and live near it. So if you're trying to attract wildlife to your property, buffers are really great for that. And then buffers actually work the opposite way too. They can exclude undesirable wildlife like geese. I have given numerous talks to homeowners associations on how to manage the stormwater ponds in their developments. And one of the first things is putting in buffers, and you don't have to necessarily have trees and shrubs. Even if you have nice, healthy, dense vegetation that maybe only gets knee or waist high, that acts to exclude geese, because geese they don't like it when they don't have a clear line of sight. And so, you know, if you are getting them landing in your body of water, your stormwater pond or whatever, and then they can't see, then they don't think it's a really safe site to, you know, go through that vegetation to get up on land. But if you're mowing right to the water's edge, clear line of sight, they can get in and out of the water just fine. So you can attract wildlife, but you can also use buffers to exclude unwanted wildlife. And like berms, while they will not prevent flooding, they will significantly moderate the impacts of flooding. Some other things that I may not think about, buffers act as carbon sequestration, carbon storage, because you have your trees oftentimes in the buffer areas. So a carbon sink. They provide what are called green corridors. So you may have buffers around your stormwater pond in your neighborhood or along the stream that runs along the, you know, the back of your property. And then your neighbors have buffers, and then there's like buffers in the little neighborhood park, and then that park, you know, the waterway connects to a bigger area, bigger city park or something. So they provide these corridors where wildlife can move, which is really significant, because when we have, especially in highly urban areas, our green spaces are very fragmented. And it's really hard for wildlife to move between spaces. I mean, how many roads do they have to cross, you know, or something? But if you can do the buffers and provide that connectivity, because again, the wildlife runs along the waterways, then that's really a plus. The buffers can also act as part of your urban forest canopy. I don't know how many, well, most cities probably do. I'm not sure about what you guys are doing up here, but I know Virginia Beach just came out with their new urban tree plan. And, you know, they've got very lofty goals, no pun intended, of increasing the tree canopy in the city because they're looking at that as a way to deal with stormwater management, but also to alleviate the heat island effect with tree canopies. And so buffers can play a part in that, very important part. They can increase your property value. I'll tell you hands down right now, the reason that my husband and I bought the house that we did was because the neighborhood that it was in had mature trees and it was wonderful. And so every time I hear, you know, a chainsaw buzzing in my neighborhood, I just cringe because, you know, cha-ching, there goes the property value. So, I mean, if you have a choice between buying a new home that had, you know, basically no trees on it versus one that did, most people, you know, will purchase the home that has the trees on it. So increasing property value. They also, again, prevent property loss by stabilizing that shoreline and that slope so that your property isn't eroding away. And then we've talked a lot about the habitat and the creatures on the land, but buffers also improve your aquatic habitat, again, by keeping sediment and pollutants out of the water, but they can also provide different types of habitat right there at the water's edge. And they can provide shade where, you know, and you've got some roots and things growing into the aquatic ecosystem that provides spawning for fish and just other types of things that vegetated edge provides on the water side of the landscape. So you kind of have to ask yourself, what is your main goal? What are you trying to achieve? And then that will play into how wide your buffer will be. And buffers can be, you know, 5 feet wide to 100 feet wide or more. It just really depends. The wider the buffer is, the more opportunity there is to check the boxes off on your list of different things that it can do. You know, a 5-foot buffer isn't going to offer a lot of habitat. You know, a lot of runoff filtration, but it would offer stabilization of your shoreline. So what is your main goal with having a buffer? And, you know, depending on how wide you make it, can you check off multiple boxes? But having some amount of buffer is better than having none at all in every case. But again, the wider it is, the more valuable it is. Right, buffers can be unique for each location, and this is something that, again, from a design perspective, if you're into landscape design and you like that, then this is, you know, provides wonderful opportunities. If landscape design isn't your thing, then sometimes putting in a buffer, which is unique for each site, just like rain gardens, can be rather frustrating or intimidating because there's no one cookie cutter recipe or pattern or design that fits every site. Sometimes you're starting from scratch and establishing a buffer. Sometimes you're working with an existing area and you're integrating the existing vegetation and things into the design. So again, each site is unique and it provides unique opportunities. And if design isn't your thing, but maybe the plants are or the stormwater is, just look around and find somebody. You know, we have a wealth of knowledge, experience, and information and skill sets within the Master Gardener community, and team up with somebody, you know, and that applies to no matter what. If you're very good in a specific area, but not so much in another area, find somebody to collaborate with or learn from. Because there's strength in the numbers and, again, our combined experiences. They can be very formally landscaped. It doesn't have to be something that looks wild and unkempt and grows snakes and rats, and we don't want it in our landscape kind of a perspective here, which I said that one time and the wildlife biologist corrected me and says, well, you won't grow both snakes and rats. You'll generally have one or the other. I said duly noted. But anyway, you want it to kind of blend with whatever your existing sort of landscape aesthetic already is. Again, you don't want it to stick out like a sore thumb. So you can have something that is very well manicured and maintained in a more formal sort of style, or you could have something that's much more naturalized looking and kind of, takes care of itself over the long term. Or you could have anything in between, some sort of a hybrid type of a system. And it could be native and non-native plants, or a mix. More often than not, it's a mix. And again, it can range greatly in how wide the buffer is. And I've been on properties where, as you progress around the reservoir or the stormwater pond, it is 5 feet wide. But then, as you move on around the property to other areas, it widens. So it doesn't have to be exactly the same width all the way around. Okay. So this is just a quick example here. This is Collie Bay in Norfolk. And what you're looking at is a project. So here's the landscape part up here. This is the buffer area here. And then it goes down into a living shoreline area and then into some wetlands. And you'll see that it's not the same all the way along this area, so that you kind of blend and work the different types of practices together based on what the site needs are. And so it's very easy to say, oh, we want a buffer, but you really need to set eyes and feet on a site, figure out how that buffer is going to integrate and work with what's already there or even what is proposed to be coming in the future. Because the buffer may be the first step. If you use a buffer and stabilize that slope, then that provides the opportunity to stop the erosion so that they can then get a living shoreline established and then get a wetlands established. So it could play an integral part and be like the first step in the process. So when you do either buffers or berms, you need eyes and feet on the site, and you need to do a site analysis, collect a lot of information to help inform the decisions about what you're doing, where it's going, how it's going to function. And again, you can start from scratch with buffers, or you can enhance an existing area. If you've already got mature trees, if you've already got stable slopes, topography, stones, things like this, healthy dense stands of vegetation, consider these assets, things that are already going right on the site, that you can incorporate, that give you a head start instead of starting from scratch or ground zero. Most buffers are a combination of woody and herbaceous plants. So like everything else in the landscape, you want your woodies, you've got your tall trees, your understory trees, your shrub layer, and then you've got your herbaceous, your perennial and ground cover layers, so that you want canopy layering. That's what makes these buffers very rich in biodiversity and makes them excellent, habitats. And then again, if you do this correctly, long term, most buffers, once the plants are established, are low maintenance. So we'll talk more about maintenance in a minute. With this picture here, what you're looking at, it's Bayville Golf Club off Shore Drive in Virginia Beach. And it used to be an old dairy farm, and it had several stormwater ponds on the property, but it also has tidal canals. And that's what you're seeing here. So this is brackish water. So here's the golf green here. They actually use the rough as part of their buffer. And then that, because this is, sort of that slope, and then it goes down into, these are Spartinas. So these are the salt grasses, salt marsh grasses. So it's a combination. And of course, golf courses, you really like to have the views change as you go around a golf course, or so I've been told. I don't play golf, sorry. And so what you're looking at here, you've got a nice clear view here. You can see the water, the vegetation is low. This is maintained here. You've got your very formal, highly maintained greens, a little bit less formal rough going down into your more naturalized area. But then you go around the course or to the next hole, and your buffer becomes wooded for that section. So it gives you a whole different view and perspective and feel to the area, but it's still functional, okay, and doing what it's supposed to do. There are some challenges that we need to think about. We're kind of all have horticulture training and experience, so we're kind of all on board with these types of concepts, but a lot of people aren't. And again, perception is everything. And I can't tell you how many people have said, I don't want a buffer. It's weedy, it's unkempt, it grows the snakes, it grows the rats, it looks ugly, and it blocks my view of the water. And I've paid a lot of money to have property on the water, which I totally understand. But you can have a buffer and do it in a way that answers all of those issues. So that's where the education comes in to folks, because you're dealing with slopes. You can have vegetation that is shorter growing so you can see over top of it. You're not blocking your view. You can have a mowed pathway or a boardwalk or something like that through the buffer so you can still access the water easily. You can have the buffer do double duty as a pollinator support area or wildlife habitat or whatever. So it can really check quite a few boxes and also, be done in a way that meets people's perceptions. Or disproves them, I should say. Again, one size buffer or buffer design does not fit all sites. And there can be a wide variation in buffers on private lands versus public lands. A lot of times in like our city parks, wildlife refuges, things like that, buffers are critical. They look different, they're managed different, and they oftentimes are wider than we might find in a more suburban or urban situation. Again, new versus integrated buffer design. The maintenance, the biggest maintenance will be getting the plants established the first growing season and keeping invasive species out. So those are the two key things. But after realistically the third year, the buffer should pretty much be able to take care of itself with very minimal focused types of maintenance involved. Again, some wildlife you want, and buffers are very good at attracting and supporting the birds, the squirrels, the little skinks and salamanders and things like that. It's also good for excluding problematic species. Doesn't do anything for the deer. Sorry, that's a lost cause. And then the cost, other parts of the landscape, you can do like a cost per square foot or something like that. It's very, very hard to do with buffers. It really depends again on, are you starting from scratch? What size plants you're putting in, how big the buffer is, all of these types of factors that impact, your budget. So costs can be very variable. And as we all know, there are ways to offset costs and think outside the box and do things so that, we're not driven by the budget. Right. The one thing that I do want to make a point of is when we talk about any kind of planting in the landscape, but especially something like buffers where you're putting in woody plants, and especially if you're starting from scratch. Okay, go in and develop this property into this subdivision or whatever, and we're going to cut down all the trees because it's just easier to deal with the property and grade it and do what we need to do if we cut down all the trees. But don't worry, we're going to go back in and plant more trees. Good for you. However, have you stopped to think, okay, that 60 or 100-year-old oak tree that you just took down, well, yay for you that you're going to put in that little 4-foot or even 6-foot, oak tree, but now you're going to have to wait decades for that tree to grow, provided it establishes, but to grow and grow healthy before it provides the same amount of environmental services and benefits as the tree that you just spent, 1 hour hacking down. So the point being, there is a time gap here between when you plant a plant and when it matures enough to provide the services that you want it to provide. So again, that goes back to site analysis. If you've got healthy trees, don't take them down. Utilize them. That's a benefit, an asset, that you already have on site that may have been decades in the making, as opposed to starting from scratch. Now, that's not to say you can't plant new things, and should, but again, just remember what you're losing versus how long it's going to take to gain back when you replant things. So there is a timeline involved. And that's what this picture shows here. So, you've got a buffer here, you've just planted it. And this is actually little tree seedlings, and they're in tubes. So what that does is protect them from the critters, and forces them to grow straight up fast, so that they get a good quick central leader and good quick start. And you leave the tubes on for the first couple years. You can see the leaves coming out the top here. And then you take them off, and then 5 to 10 years, and then 10 plus years is really when you're going to be getting the benefits, especially with your trees. If you're just doing shrubs and herbaceous plants, it'll come within that 3 to 5 year range. But there is a time delay there. Can't do the fast forward button. All right. So again, pictures worth 1,000 words, because this is not acceptable, and buffers are really what will prevent this type of problem. So in the top here, this is the call that I got. We've lost 4 feet of property, because here's the drainage pipe from the gutters off of the property, right, coming into this stormwater pond. And you can see that the bank has been undercut, and they had a huge goose problem on this site. And what happened is, homeowners association, people on the association board and on the landscape committee changed, as they do. The new people thought, okay, we can get a new landscape contractor and save some money. And they had a beautiful buffer, but the new people on the board and then the new landscape contractor decided just to mow the grass to the water's edge. They thought that would be less overall maintenance and a better solution to their budget and whatnot. And once they started losing property, then they call me going, how do we get it back? Well, you can't unless you're going to spend 6-digit figures to dredge, which is a horrible process, very destructive. But you can stop it from eroding further immediately by just stop mowing. And all it took was a conversation with the landscape contractor. See the mow line here? Nobody wants to mow here anyway, because you don't want equipment rolling into the water, and you don't want to spend the time to have somebody weed whack it. So, pick a spot on this slope somewhere. Usually it's where it would be better if it was up here where the slope really starts going down. But stop. And then a lot of the plants that they had in the buffer originally came back. So it was really good. And that was something easy to do. Didn't cost them anything. The landscaper was probably happy. They saved money because that's less area that they're having to pay to be maintained. And that gives them time to assess the situation, decide what they want to do long-term on that site. So, and then down here, this is stream blowout. Just because too much water too fast coming into this waterway, and the banks are not stabilized. And so you can see where it turns, it's just cutting away. And that happens probably every reasonable storm event. All right. This is not acceptable either. Okay. Everything that is done in these landscapes, and you can tell the lawn is well maintained, which means all of the nutrients and, things like that. If the turf can't take up those nutrients, it all goes into the water. Okay. And that's a problem. So this really, and the only reason that you have vegetation here is because that's in the water, and they can't mow that unless they weed eat it. Right. So this is just not acceptable either. But you don't want this either, there is a house behind those trees. So you've got to find somewhere in between, somewhere in that happy sort of middle ground here. But I guarantee you, in a storm event, that property will suffer significantly less damage than the adjacent properties. All right, so let's talk maintenance of buffers before we look at more pretty pictures. A lot of the maintenance is dependent on the design. Um, picking the plants that will thrive in that particular area, in that low, that middle, that high planting zone area on that slope. If you've already got trees, making sure that you're not planting plants that need full sun. So again, it's no different than designing for your landscape. You have to do sort of the site assessment and the environmental conditions and match up, the plants to the site and the plants to the function and the plants to whoever the property owner is and what their vision is for that site. It also depends on the age of the buffer. Generally, the older the buffer is, the less maintenance that is required. Again, if it is new, the establishment period is very critical. Getting the plants established and thriving and keeping out the competition, the weeds, the invasive species, those types of things. And there are specific tasks to do. Sometimes plant canopies need to be raised, like on your trees, so that the understory plants have that air circulation and that light so that they can grow, or that you're not shading the water too much. Or again, going in and very strategically selectively removing those undesirable species. And that's tricky because you're adjacent to water. So you can't just go in and arbitrarily spray stuff. You would need an herbicide that has an aquatic label in case it runs off or you get drift or you pop a hole in your spray tank and it all leaks into the water. So you need something that's properly labeled. You again are trying to maintain vegetation. So if you're spraying, you need a shield so that you're very like spot treating anything. And if that seems too sort of risky for you, then do the old dip and clip, mix up an herbicide. A lot of times these invasive plants are perennials. So you want an herbicide that is absorbed into the plant, like 2,4-D or glyphosate, because a lot of these invasives are broadleafs. And dip the clippers and clip it off this time of the year, September, October, as it's translocating down to go dormant. You use the plant systems against it and it sucks the herbicide down in and you get a much higher % kill, but it's very, very targeted. It's like having laparoscopic surgery. They make a teeny tiny little incision to do what they need to do. So it's very surgical, very focused, and there's not the potential there for damage to the surrounding vegetation. Your herbicide. Yeah. Okay, so the question is a clarification on the process for the dip and clip, and which plants. So blackberry briars, poison ivy, trumpet creeper, porcelain berry, Phragmites, any of these very tough perennials, tree seedlings. Maybe you've got a bunch of tree seedlings that you don't want. If you pull them out, it's going to kind of destabilize that slope or something. So it's much easier to mix an herbicide, one that again is absorbed into the plant, and translocated, and do it at a time when the plant is translocating downward, moving all of that energy downward to go dormant for the winter. And what you're doing is clipping it at the ground, and then the plant's response is to immediately suck down and seal off that wound. So it's sucking the herbicide down into the lower part of the stem and the root zone. And so that will give you a higher % kill of these perennial plants. You asked specifically about chameleon plant. That's Houtonia, if I'm not mistaken, which is a ground cover. Your neighbor planted it and now it's visiting your yard and causing you headaches. That is probably more of a spot treatment situation. And you probably would want to treat it like you do English ivy, because Houtonia has a kind of a waxy coat on the leaves. If you mow it, and then all the new growth sprouts, spray it before the waxy coat gets on the leaf. And you still have time to do that this fall. We're still early enough in the fall. If you were like in the beginning of November or something, no. You can also retreat in spring. But in spring, all that energy in the roots is going up for new growth. So if you use a translocated herbicide, you will get kill or dieback, but it's not as a higher percent because again, you're translocating that herbicide to the top of the plant, not the roots, which can regrow in some cases. So yeah, Houtonia, it's a ground cover. It's not like something that has a vine or a trunk, that has one stem that's easy to clip. You don't mix your herbicides any stronger than what the labeled rate tells you based on what weed you're dealing with. And just remember to clean your clippers or your loppers before you prune something desirable in the landscape. But it is just, you use a lot less product. It's a lot less potential for environmental issues or damage to the desirable species. And when you do it in the fall, people tend to expect things to sort of die in the fall, the leaves fall off the trees and stuff like that. So if you're removing vegetation, it's not so obvious like it would be in the spring. And again, if it's something deciduous, people expect that. And then the last question on this list is who's doing the maintenance? Is it you? Which is fine. But if not, you need to know exactly what you want done and be able to communicate that to whoever is working in this area. It is a very sensitive area. You can't just go in and say, prune this, or get the weeds out. You have to be a little more specific. And again, hopefully talk to somebody who has some knowledge of what they're doing or stand there and train them, to do this. So. There is an organization, we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's look at examples, pictures. So again, you can have a more formal looking type of a buffer here with evergreen and deciduous shrubbery as the main focus, or you could have more of this sort of wildflower meadow style. And then what happens here is this gets mowed once a year in like February. And that helps spread the seeds that have been up over the winter and not gotten eaten. And it takes away a lot of the debris, mulches it up for organic matter, and then gives all the plants sort of an equal start. And also provides the shortest amount of time between when you cut and when the plants regrow. You want the stems and things left up over the winter. A lot of your beneficial insects are in the plant stems, but there's also the seed for the wildlife, especially the birds. And then mow it down, and then it grows back relatively quick so that it's the shortest time between when you've kind of got nothing there and then when you've got your meadow back. You could also do that in a way where you plant in large groupings or sweeps of plants for better visual interest. So you have a whole block of purple coneflowers and a whole block of brown-eyed Susans or whatever it is that you're planting, instead of this, which is a very randomized one here, one here, one here kind of thing. So it kind of depends on the aesthetic that you're going for. This is more of a woody buffer here. This has got a lot of things like your salt or groundsel bushes and other types of woody shrubs. It's also got a really great patch of blackberries here. They decided to leave because there's a pathway all the way around this pond on this other side, and there's a bridge right here. You can see the hand railing. And people like to walk, and so, grab a few blackberries and munch them while you're walking. Hey, it's great. But their maintenance here on this is to come in like every 2 or 3 years and strategically remove the tree seedlings. Because it's woody, they're not going to mow this area every year. But you don't want the trees either because this just isn't wide enough to support trees. But the trees will seed in. So yeah, just take your little dip and clip, and then this one is, this is that earlier picture where I showed you the no mow line. So the grasses have come back first, with some other things. And then what they decided was, certain areas they would just leave like this, but other areas they would, deliberately plant highly ornamental, plants that bloomed, spring through fall. So they wanted a plant list that would work in the buffer in full sun, that could tolerate the mowing once a year, but also would provide interest in 3 seasons of the year. All right, this is the buffer at the research center. We have 1 stormwater pond on the property, and this was the condition of it. Good Lord, was this like 15 or 16 years ago, maybe? You can see the bank is getting undercut. We're in need of some trees here that got pruned out because they were in imminent danger of falling in the pond. And they had dropped all kinds of debris. We had a bunch of algae growing, heavy shade, so not a lot of plant material was growing. This is where the water line should be, where this undercutting is. This was the year that we were 10 inches below average on rainfall. Hey, what a great opportunity to redo the buffer and stabilize the slope in the pond, because you can get in there with knee boots and not have to get in there with, chest waders. So what we did, we knew where the water line is, and that's where these core logs are. So it's COIR, that's coconut fiber. So those are staked in. And what we did was we staked those in, all of this muck or an organic matter, we got in there and pitchforked it up onto the bank. The logs prevent things from sliding back down the slope into the pond. And that's great organic matter that deepened the edge there, which means when the water level does go back up, we'll have a deeper edge, and that's less aquatic weed problems. And then on the really steep slope, we did a core blanket over here. And then we planted on the downslope side, which is right at the water's edge, and then we planted the middle slope and the top of the slope on this project. And so this is kind of what it looked like that first year. We mulched it heavily. That establishment period. And we did some herbaceous plants down here like pickerel, soft rush, lizard tail in the shade, that sort of thing that likes the wet feet. Up here we did hibiscus and several other types of things that don't mind periodic inundation. And then up here you have your more traditional landscape plants. And then that's the following year. So you can see it's filling in, but realistically, not happen until year 3. So we also had done a terraced stepping area here to the pond. Unfortunately, people took that as an invitation to come in and fish the pond, which, that's not something they're supposed to do. Plus, we use experimental chemicals at the research center, and you don't want anything that's growing in that pond. And one lady was letting her dog swim in the pond, and I'm like, ma'am, I advise you to take your dog home and give him a bath immediately, because you don't know what's in that pond. And we had to, make appropriate signage and things to let people know. And eventually we took the walk. It was for us to access the pond for maintenance, because we had aerators and we had a pump house and everything out there for irrigation. It wasn't ever meant for the public access. So sometimes you have to think about what you're doing. All right, that's one end of the pond. That was the shallow end of that pond. We had the other end of the pond that was really, really steep banks. And so they had dumped all kinds of construction debris and, you name it, it had been dumped there over the years. So all that got cleared out. The banks got regraded, but they were still pretty steep. So what we did was took the same core logs, just used them in a different way to create this terracing here. And then these are Master Gardener water stewards from Virginia Beach doing this right here. And there's me. I never ask them to do anything that I don't get in and do myself. But what we're doing is installing what's called live stakes. So we put the core logs in, we backfilled with a little bit of compost. And then in the fall, you get like 3-foot sections of branches of things like yellow and red twig dogwoods, viburnums, deciduous hollies, willows, things like that, that root easy. And you just make sure you know which end is the upright end. the growing point, and then you stick them in very densely, and then you just walk away. And, you know, if you get 60 to 80% rooting over the winter time, you're doing really good because there's no way to irrigate a situation like this. And so, and then we came back after we did the stakes and this filled in with mulch. But we had really good success, and within 2 years, that whole bank was filled in and stabilized with shrubbery. All right, you can also do live stakes. They come in bundles. We were on a shoestring budget, so they come in bundles of 50. We broke the bundle open and stuck the stakes individually. On something like this, where they've got more serious slope here with this retaining wall and things, you see the bundles, they just lay the bundles and then fill over top of them. And even though they're horizontal, they will root and grow up. So that's kind of what it looks like there. So yeah, they definitely need stabilization because look at the proximity here to the corner of the house. That's not good. And you can see they put in a couple of trees here. So there's that's why site analysis is important because every site's different. This is just an example of what you can do instead of having nothing here, you know, have something like this. You're not blocking the view of the water this way. The slope is stabilized. You can still see from all of the windows and the porch up here at the house through the tree canopy, and you can still have access with your deck and your pathway down to it. This is much, much better than this. This is the Hermitage. Some of you may have visited it in Norfolk, but they have the river here that goes around the, this is the formal garden here and the residence. It's a museum. So this area, they have aerial photographs of how much erosion and property loss since like the early 1900s. So they went in with a, this is more of a wetland / buffer. So this is the lower part of the buffer that wetland areas that they've created with the brackish water grasses. So this was one part. They put in these riprap tow revetments here to slow the boat wakes coming off the river. And then planted the salt grasses. But then up here, this gets inundated less frequently. This is always inundated less frequently here. So you need to know which species grow in which area. And you can bet they were really concerned because, you know, the erosion under this brick wall around the formal garden that's around the house, you know, they needed to do something to fix it. The string is for goose protection because the geese will just come and either eat it or just pull it out of the ground. And then, of course, they also made it a teaching area and accessed it with a boardwalk. But you can see how it's filling in really well. Sure.
With the combined problem of sinking land and rising water, what are the chances that will be able to remain?
Okay, so the question is with the issues of our, sinking land and our water level rise, it's a short-term fix, in all honesty, something like that with the Hermitage. Eventually, they're going to have to look at either putting some type of a hard shoreline bulkhead or something, or giving up and letting the land continue to recede inward with the wetlands. They're already fighting the battle on the other side of their property as well. They've got, that's a structural issue on the other side because the slope is so steep and it's much closer to the house. And so they've got some serious issues to deal with. You do what you can. There's no getting around the fact that, we're kind of caught in the middle. So, all right, this is the back of my former home in Norfolk. Here's my little buffer here. You can see the salt bushes because this is a tidal marsh here. And then I had some other plants here because this was the most sun for my backyard. So in a rain shower or a hurricane where water is water is usually sucked out of the marsh in a hurricane. The water comes up and inundates here periodically. In a nor'easter, the water comes midway up through the yard. This is the corner of my patio here. Because in a nor'easter, the winds are different and push the water into the marsh. And then you have extreme events that unfortunately are happening more frequently and are more extreme. And I wish I never knew that these pictures were going to end up in a presentation. So when I took them, so I really wish I had taken pictures of my neighbor's yards. So this is my yard. You can see the white caps out here. You can see the ripples here. My neighbor on the left had a bulkhead that got destroyed and he lost property, it washed out behind the bulkhead and everything. My neighbor on the right had riprap. And she had, there was a muskrat den. They had tunneled under the riprap and excavated out and made a den. And so the water, of course, went in and through the riprap and just washed out what remained of the bank. And she had a big hackberry tree fall over. Fortunately, not on her house, but basically all the soil that held the roots just went away. So they both had major damage and they were both in their 80s at the time that this happened. The bulkhead guy had to have, a permit, had to go through the permit process to get a permit to repair the bulkhead, had to be inspected. Then he had to pay to have the fill hauled in. Then he had to, repair the landscape where all the equipment had come in and all that. The lady on the right had to work to fix the erosion and redo the riprap and whatnot. I just had to prune these bushes because they got broken because of the wave action and pick up just a little bit of debris in my yard. So buffers don't prevent flooding, but they significantly moderate the amount of damage. All right. So let's wrap this up with resources. You do have this picture on your handout, and I find it really important because shorelines have a lot of different organizations and agencies that have jurisdiction over shorelines. And at one point it used to, I think I counted up, there used to be like 16 agencies, depending on what part of the shoreline you're on and what you're trying to do. But the key ones are the Army Corps of Engineers, the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, and the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. So these are all the people that deal with the engineering and the structural and the regulatory aspects of what you do on that shoreline. Okay. There are other resources to be aware of, and I've listed again all of these on your handout in no particular order. If you're dealing with brackish water, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science is your go-to, and they have a really great publication, and I think I've got a picture of it that shows you the different sections of shorelines and buffers and what plants grow in those areas based on water levels. Chesapeake Bay Foundation has some good resources and information. Up here, you've got the James River Association. They are very proactive, knowledgeable, lots of different programs and information available. You need to be familiar with the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area called CBPA, but also the Resource Protection Area, the RPA, because that's generally where the buffers fall in the landscape. And each jurisdiction, each locality, each city, it can be in a different department, but this is something that is regulated. I mean, cutting down vegetation, filling in, putting docks and piers and bulkheads in without permits, putting riprap in. All of these things require permits. Now they have created a joint permit process, which is a lot easier than it was just 10 years ago. But each locality enforces these regulations a little bit differently. Virginia Beach, pretty strict. Norfolk, pretty strict. Chesapeake, not so much. So it just depends. And it could be in the stormwater department. It could be in your planning department. So those terms are something you need to know about, and you need to know who's who in your community that deals with those. If you're not going to do work yourself, there are cost share programs out there because this can be considered a stormwater management practice. So you have the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program that will help cost share and some of your local grassroots organizations. I know on our side, like Elizabeth River Project and Lynn Haven River Now, they've got grant monies. They will help cost share design, plant purchases, and installation costs. They won't pay for everything, but they will help with the costs. And then again, if you're not going to do it, who will? The Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Group. This is a bay-wide, so it covers 6 states and Washington, D.C. These are people that have training specifically in dealing with stormwater management practices and designing, installing, and maintaining them in landscapes. And you can, I think, get on their website, type in your zip code and find out who in your area does this type of work. So, all right. As educators, who might be your potential collaborators if this is something that you get asked or as part of one of your programs, or you need to do a site visit evaluation? Who's doing things like this in your area? The James River Association, I think, is probably your biggest local group. But again, there are grassroots organizations for specific rivers or water bodies. This is that thing from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Each of these areas is color coded, and then you go look up the plant and it's in a color coded box that tells you which specific area it will grow in. A lot of these grassroots organizations, though, have lists, have cost share programs, have information, handouts, things on their websites. So if it's not something you can do, be familiar with resources that you can direct people to when they come to you with questions. And as always, make sure you vet these sources. It's not somebody's blog or, personal website. These need to be extension, university, botanical garden, or other knowledgeable, reliable resources that you send people to. The Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, which is a cost share program across the state, is run through your local soil and water conservation districts. So find out who's who there and whether or not they're, administering that program and what the process is. Again, so you're in the know, you can take advantage of it for yourself, but also when the questions come, you know how to direct people. Right. Thank you to a lot of people for a lot of pretty pictures. And thank you very much for your time and attention this morning.
Thank you for watching this presentation by the James City County Williamsburg Master Gardener Association. Please visit our website for more educational videos at jccwmg.org.